The day before today, which was yesterday, I made a longer video in which I showed a Romanian commercial that's making fun of communism. And a lot of you guys asked me two questions. One was, what is that commercial about, and can I talk more about it? And two, how much of it was actually accurate? So today I want to just talk about those two commercials and look at how they describe communism in Romania.
Făceam Partidul te vrea tuns, lacăre.
Rome Chocolate Bar. Strong sensation since 1964.
During the enlightened golden age of socialism in my country, one of the few chocolate bars available on the market was this chocolate bar called Rom. And because almost everyone at the time ate that chocolate, it creates a sense of nostalgia. Now, it's not the most delicious chocolate in the world, but almost everyone can remember the taste. And their decision to have a commercial based on that particular time period was nothing short of genius. Now, obviously, the commercial is a little bit exaggerated, but it has a couple of elements that almost everyone can recognize. So, one of the first elements are the secret police officers, which are dressed exactly like civilians. And you can see this if you watch Chernobyl, the TV show, something very similar, where one of the scientist ladies starts threatening that she's going to blow the lid on the whole scandal and she's going to make it public. And immediately, a couple of civilians that were sitting on a bench behind her get up and arrest her. So, the idea of a secret police was prevalent throughout all of the Iron Curtain states. And everyone knew that they should be absolutely terrified of them. If you see a person being disappeared by the secret police, you are not supposed to ask questions because the next day you could disappear. One of the scariest stories that I have found was that my grandfather, which at the time was a university professor at medicine, he had a Russian car. It was a different brand of vehicle that wasn't on the Romanian market. And because he was a university professor, he had like one of these privileges where he could buy one from Russia. And one day he parked it in the same place he always parked it, but there was a visit from a official dignitary into my town. And when my grandfather goes back to his car, it wasn't there. So he starts looking around, and eventually he finds one of these people dressed as civilians, which are saying that, yeah, your car is over there. It's like, what do you mean? Well, we're from the secret police and we had to move it because the dignitary didn't have a place where to park. And they were like, well, how did you manage to get in? It's like, oh, don't worry, we have a key. And there are people which also claims that the secret police had keys to their own houses and keys to their own cars, and they were the boogeyman at the time, which meant that you couldn't really trust anyone. And again, if people were to see someone just being thrown in a car, like you see in this commercial, they'll probably, not talk about it or just turn the other way because they didn't want to get involved in the drama. Now, another interesting thing is rock and roll music was actually heavily suppressed. It wasn't made illegal by any law, although it was illegal to interact with foreigners, which was really interesting. And this is why I keep saying that if the communists from my country were alive today, the people in the West will call them far right, even though they were absolutely far left. Like, you couldn't get more left than these communists. But because of some of their policies, like encouraging nationalism, shooting people that try to hop the border, heavily suppressing LGBT people by imprisoning them, banning abortions, encouraging birth rates in the population. All of these things would classify them as far right by the woke people today. It's also because I don't think that the woke people today are actual communists. I think they are corporate pawns. They're part of a controlled ideology that's a controlled opposition ideology. in order to benefit corporations. Like, name me one corporation that has failed because of socialism, you know. But anyway, right? That's behind the point. I don't want to go on a tangent. What I wanted to talk about is something very interesting. We actually had laws that promoted xenophobia. Xenophobia was mandated by the state, and it's very interesting. It's not because the state was xenophobic, because the state had many dealings with the West and with places like the Middle East. In fact, my town was a university city, and a lot of foreigners were encouraged to come over here and study. The reason you had laws that forbid you from talking with a foreigner, and this was actually punishable by imprisonment. So imagine this ridiculous aspect where you can go to university and you have colleagues that are foreigners, but you're not allowed to talk with them because you're breaking the law. And the reason for this was that they didn't want an exchange of information between how life is outside the Iron Curtain and how life is in here. Because then the people would start asking questions. Like, I remember having a relative which managed to leave the country on official business. He was allowed to leave. And when he came back, he told us that what he saw in the West was that there were no electric shortages, the stores were filled with food, there was no shortage of hot water, and the television was on 24/7, and you had more than 50 channels. And literally no one believed him. Like, people were just thinking that he is lying and he is just being a twat. Like, it's impossible that things are that good outside. Like, people would think that, yes, maybe outside the Iron Curtain things are good, but no one would think like it's that good. Like, for us, it was heaven. It was the idea of paradise, just from his description. But what I wanted to go with this was the idea of rock and roll. So rock and roll was heavily suppressed. Now, I generally thought a lot about why this was, because most rock and roll bands were leftist, according to the West. But in order to get one, you had to talk with a foreigner or someone who has been to the West, which would get you in trouble if you listen to this particular genre of music. And I think that the reason the communists banned it was for the same thing. Like, they didn't want the West to influence in any way the people living under the Iron Curtain. And rock and roll music was definitely viewed as American imperialist propaganda. So it again, like, if you had some rock and roll in your car, they wouldn't be upset that you have it, but they would ask, where did you get it from? And you had to answer this difficult question. Now, having long hair as a man meant that you might be a person that listens to this type of devil music, which would get you into trouble because you're not equal with everyone, you're not fitting. Like, you might be part of a culture that is different to the socialist revolutionary culture. So if you are a guy that had long hair, your teachers would definitely tell you to shave it. If you didn't, then you could have problems, like you'd be summoned by the principal, and if you still refused, then your parents could get into trouble. Like, they would call your parents at school and tell you, no, you're going to cut your son's hair. So that's what this commercial is actually about. This is why, they say the party wants your head shaved, rocker, because rock and roll music was heavily suppressed here. Just like almost any other thing coming from the West.
Tovarășă, nu tolerăm așa ținută de minijoc pentru tineretul comunist. Luați-o! E o provocare!
So the second commercial, starring Misty from Pokemon, has the actual Great Deer Leader. This is a caricature which meant to represent Ceausescu. And he would often do these official state visits, going into schools, factories, or other places of work, in order to analyze if everything is up to standard. And these little kids with the Romanian flag and dressed in uniforms represent the pioneers, they were called. They were young kids that were heavily indoctrinated into the party ideology. and you would find them on a lot of communist propaganda posters. Now, what's also interesting is that from kindergarten, and I actually do have a very good memory of some of the things in my childhood, but from kindergarten, you were being indoctrinated into the party ideology, and it would go all the way through the high school. And they would have like all these weird and bizarre stories that would give the grade year leader supernatural and fantastic powers. Like he would go into a factory that was in collapse and it wouldn't produce anything. And he would just go there, start pointing his fingers and talk and give some orders. And all of a sudden, not only is the factory producing again, but it's out competing all in production, all the other factories around. So you had like these very supernatural stories with, like the grade year leader one day just decided to take a walk and, he saw a village amidst poverty. And he went there, told the villagers a couple of socialist messages, and then all of a sudden the village just started flourishing, and a couple of years later become into one of the biggest cities in the country. Like nonsense, absolute nonsense, that you are being spoon-fed as a child. And it was nonsense at school, nonsense on the television, and if you dared to question or ask, anything against the nonsense, you would all of a sudden find out that you're getting low grades. You would find out that your friends are ostracizing you. It was really bad. And it was also interesting that they wouldn't lock you up if you talked against the nonsense. What would happen is you would get fired. Like in order to have a job, you needed to own a communist membership card. You needed to be a member of the Communist Party. And the moment you would do something bad, like wrong thing, they would just take your communist membership card away, which means that now you can't get a promotion. If you were in a position of authority, they would fire you. It was very difficult to find another job. And if you were really, really obnoxious, like let's say you started writing a book, heaven forbid, what they would do is that they would call you crazy, they would call you insane, and they would lock you up in a mental asylum, which was worse than a prison. Because in a prison, at least you knew when your release date is going to arrive, but in a mental asylum, you would just be put on drugs in a bed, just pumped up, full of drugs, and you would just be asleep for years. It was just inhumane. And it looked good on the papers because it's like, hey, look, Romania is not arresting dissidents anymore. It's not. It's the good version of communism. We're not locking people up for wrong thing. No, they're just happening to be crazy. Why would you believe in the writings of a ranting lunatic? But anyway, right. So back to this commercial. Yeah, this is an official state visit, and one of the reasons communists hated freedom of expression and they didn't allow people to dress however they wanted is that they claimed if you don't have a uniform at school, kids that come from impoverished families are going to feel marginalized than the kids that are more wealthy and they can afford better clothes. In reality, money didn't really matter under communism because when you went into a store to buy something, the store was empty. And when you went to actually find things, most of the things were rationed. And for example, you're only allowed to buy 1 liter of oil per month. So you had this punch card that whatever you bought, the bottle of oil, they would make a hole in that card, and that was it. You couldn't buy any more oil that month. So it was like this epic journey to, first of all, get the money, then find the store that actually sells and still has oil, and then make sure that you still have like 1 free ticket on that punch card so you can purchase it. And when all the stars aligned, you could then buy oil. And it wasn't just for oil. It was for meat, it was for eggs, it was for car gas. Another funny thing about the cars was the number of the car. You were only allowed to drive a car during the weekend if the number was null and the weekend came from a null week. Or if the number was odd and the weekend was an odd week, then that's what you could drive. Like if you had an odd number, you couldn't drive in the weekend of a null week, right? So, but all of these things are just so gone in the past that it's difficult to imagine living in a time period like that. And what's even more funny is like the scene in this commercial with the ladies in uniforms, and it looks like something out of A Handmaid's Tale. When in reality this was under communism. Like a lot of people would associate this with National Socialism. No, it's just socialism. Okay, So to me, it's really funny when I see people in the West say that, oh, any of these things would make you far right. No, they would make you far left. It's all about authoritarianism, really. Like once you give the entire power of the state to a handful of people and they can do whatever they want, then they will do whatever they want. Like they will not fulfill the promises. Like this is what boggles my brain. We're used to politicians lying. Like we're used to politicians promising something and they're not delivering it. And this isn't a democratic system where they know that in 4 years they might be replaced if they don't fulfill the promise. Why on earth would you want to start a revolution to give all the power in the state to a couple of people that are going to be held unaccountable for anything they do? And you allow them to control every minute and micro aspect of your life, to how you dress, to the haircut you're having, to what you're thinking. Like all of these things are under their control. For example, look, another problem was they consider housing to be a human right. So nationalize housing. No one gets to own houses. And the moment you did something bad, the government could just take your house away and you were on the streets. Because it's not your house, you're just lending it from the government. This is what really pisses me off, because I look at the West and they haven't experienced any of these things. And they don't know what they're talking about. They absolutely don't know. And they look at these things and they think it's fascist. It's like, no, it's socialists did it as well. And I think they even did it more better and more cruel than any other ideology in human history. Let me know what you think, and I'll be looking forward to reading from you guys in the comment section.